There's a strange comfort that comes from entering a world where the living and the dead are separated only by a piano melody. When I first encountered Corpse Bride, 2005, I remember being struck not by its morbidity but by its elegance, a sort of gothic tenderness that felt both macabre and heartbreakingly human. It's as if Tim Burton had taken a faded photograph from a Victorian parlor and breathed movement into it, letting the dust dance in the candlelight while faint laughter drifted between shadows. To my literature-loving friends, this isn't simply an animated fantasy. It's a parable wrapped in dark lace, about love's strange persistence in places we seldom look, in memory, in regret, in death, and even in the awkward stumbles of the living. The story begins in a gray, joyless town where two timid souls, Victor Van Dort and Victoria Everglot, are set to marry for reasons that have more to do with family ambition than romance. Their engagement feels arranged not by affection but by economic desperation. Her parents need his family's money. His parents crave her family's name. Yet amid the awkward rehearsals and social expectations, something soft begins to stir between them. Something genuine. Victor, nervous and fumbling, can't even recite his vows correctly. He wanders into the woods to practice, a place that looks as though it's been drained of color and hope. There in the half-light, he slides a wedding ring onto what he thinks is a branch, and the branch curls back, revealing a hand, pale, slender, and belonging to a woman long dead. This eerie gesture, almost poetic in its innocence, ignites the rest of the tale. The corpse bride, who rises from the ground, Emily, isn't monstrous. She's tragic, luminous in her loneliness. She believes she's finally been claimed by love, after years of waiting beneath the soil. And suddenly, Victor is pulled from his dreary world of obligation into an underworld teeming with color, music, and a sense of freedom that's ironically more alive than the surface he came from. The world of the dead is painted in jazz and neon, the world of the living in silence and gray. It's a reversal of expectation, a fairy tale inverted by mortality. I've always thought Corpse Bride as a dance between two tones, melancholy and mischief. Burton and co-director Mike Johnson create a universe where skeletons tell jokes, maggots recite Shakespearean lines, and love transcends decay. Beneath the humor, though, lies something far more delicate. A question about the promises we make and break, the ways we wound those who wait for us, and the longing to belong even when the world has forgotten our names. When Victor finds himself torn between Victoria, the living fiancée he barely knows, and Emily, the ethereal bride who clings to hope from beyond, the film stops being about death at all. It becomes a meditation on choice, on the way to commitment, and the unspoken fear of letting anyone truly see us. There's something distinctly literary in its rhythm, too. Each frame feels like a stanza. Each shadow is a metaphor. Burton's fascination with the outcast finds its purest voice here. Emily, the corpse bride, isn't frightening. She's a victim of betrayal of human greed, of promises made in candlelight and broken at dawn. Through her, the film invites us to mourn not the dead, but the living, those who move through existence without passion or purpose. The land of the living, ironically, is where souls are cold. The underworld, buzzing with brass music and glowing spirits, is where hearts still beat. I remember the first time the piano duet between Victor and Emily begins. Their fingers, ivory against ivory, mirror each other, one warm, one cold. There's no dialogue, just a swelling of notes that speak of connection without words. It's that sequence that convinced me Corpse Bride isn't merely Gothic animation. It's poetry rendered in motion, stop motion at that, a medium where every blink, every breath, is sculpted by human hands. The imperfections of clay, the tiny textures, make every emotion feel tactile. You can sense the time it took to make her eyelids flutter, his hands tremble, the candle smoke twist into air. That physical craftsmanship mirrors the theme itself. Love as something fragile yet eternal, assembled piece by piece through patience and faith. As the story unfolds, we begin to sense that Victor's journey isn't about choosing between two women, but between two ways of living, fear and freedom. The living world is rigid, bound by manners and hierarchy. The world of the dead celebrates imperfection and truth. Burton has always loved outsiders. Edward Scissorhands, Jack Skellington, Ichabod Crane. And in Victor and Emily, he creates another duality, the fearful man and the fearless spirit. Theirs is a romance that defies logic, One exists in the past, the other in hesitation. Yet their meeting awakens both. Emily learns to let go, and Victor learns to feel. For all its shadows, Corpse Bride glows with empathy. It doesn't punish death, it redeems it. The humor, skeletons drinking through hollow skulls, a severed head rolling across the floor, serves as relief, but also humanizes the afterlife. When Emily enters Victor's world, bursting into a church filled with shocked guests, she isn't the monster they think she is. She's the ghost of every lost promise that haunts us when we choose convenience over conviction. That's what makes the movie so haunting. It turns a simple ghost story into an elegy for sincerity. The film's emotional heartbeat rests in that final act, where love's true form isn't possession, but release. The moment Emily realizes Victor belongs to the living, to life, to possibility, she smiles, forgives, and dissolves into a cloud of butterflies. That imagery still lingers. Love, when purified by loss, becomes light. It's the kind of ending that doesn't shout. It sighs. You walk away feeling both mournful and peaceful, as though you've just listened to a waltz played on bones. For those of us who see cinema as a kind of modern literature, Corpse Bride speaks a language we recognize, the one that mixes darkness with grace, death with devotion. It's not a story of horror, but of hope disguised in sorrow's clothing. Burton doesn't ask us to fear the grave. He asks us to fear a loveless life. And that, my friends, is what keeps this tale from ever decaying. Even after all these years, I can still hear the piano echoing faintly in the distance, inviting us to remember that sometimes the dead are more alive than we are, because they've learned to love without fear. The first half of the film unfolds like an old storybook that's been left open too long in the attic. Its pages grayed by dust, its words trembling between humor and melancholy. We open on an overcast town that looks carved from soot, every chimney puffing out fatigue. There's a church bell ringing somewhere far away, not in celebration but in routine, the kind of sound that tells you life here moves on clockwork rather than passion. It's a Victorian world, proper and pinched, where the dead probably laugh louder than the living. Into this dreary place walks Victor Van Dort, a young man with the soft shoulders of someone raised to please everyone but himself. His parents, new money merchants with anxious eyes, have arranged a marriage that will drag them upward in class. On the other end of the bargain stand the Everglods, Victoria's parents, aristocrats who have a name but not the fortune. It's a trade of desperation, reputation for wealth, class for cash. The rehearsal for this wedding is the first real glimpse we get of Burton satire. The church looks magnificent and cold, with candles that flicker like they want to leave. Pastor Galswells, a rigid figure of the old world, watches every movement with suspicion. Victor's hands shake as he tries to rehearse his vows. Victoria, gentle and wide-eyed, tries to comfort him, but her mother's glare snuffs out the tenderness like a draft. Their dialogue is stilted, polite, yet underneath it runs a quiet yearning. You sense two people born into roles too small for their hearts. He sketches butterflies and dreams of music. She reads by candlelight and imagines kindness in a husband she hasn't yet met. When Victor fumbles a rehearsal, the rings slipping and the vows tripping, humiliation floods the room. The priest dismisses him. His parents sigh. Even the candles seem to dim a little more. What fascinates me every time is how this moment, so simple, almost comic, contains the film's entire moral seed. Victor's mistake isn't forgetfulness. It's sincerity misfiring in a world that worships form over feeling. Ashamed, he retreats into the fog-covered woods to practice alone, carrying his vows like a confession. The trees here bend like crooked fingers. The air feels thick with unspoken stories. He rehearses again and again, finding a rhythm, let his heart finally speak instead of his nerves. And then, in an act both innocent and fateful, he slips the wedding ring onto what he thinks is a branch. The camera holds just long enough for us to notice the bark's delicate shape, slender, human, too elegant to be wood. The soil stirs. A hand erupts from the earth and catches his. The shock of that scene still sends a chill through me. The silence before her emergence, the sound of crow flapping away, and then Emily, the corpse bride, pulling herself into moonlight. She's draped in torn lace that once dreamed of purity. Her voice trembles between love and lament. When she whispers, "You may now kiss the bride," the forest becomes a cathedral of irony. Victor's confusion turns to terror as roots twist around his feet. In a dizzy blur, he's pulled downward into the underworld. What's extraordinary about the transition isn't just visual. It's emotional whiplash. The world above, though alive, was colorless. The world below, though dead, bursts into blues, purples, and brass music. Skeletons swing on chandeliers. Spirits clink glasses of something glowing, and a limbless waiter slides past with cheer. Burton flips the natural order. Life is gray. Death is jazz. Victor's terror gradually melts into wonder as the dead greet him like an honored guest. The bone jangle sequence, with its playful musical storytelling, is a masterstroke, a tale within a tale. Through song, they narrate Emily's tragedy, a young bride-to-be who waited for her lover in the woods, only to be murdered and robbed. Her ring was stolen, her body discarded, her spirit left yearning. Now, she believes Victor's proposal fulfills the promise she died waiting for. As the music fades, Victor begins to grasp the nightmare he stumbled into. Emily adores him with all the intensity of a heart that's been broken for centuries. She calls him husband, guides him through the glowing caverns of the afterlife, and introduces him to its strange citizens. A beheaded waiter, a sarcastic skeleton couple, a maggot that serves as her conscience, an elder Gough, an ancient skeleton with the patience of dust. The atmosphere is morbidly cheerful, but Victor's eyes stay haunted by confusion. He keeps thinking of Victoria, of her soft smile and trembling kindness. He insists the marriage was a mistake, that he belongs to the living. But Emily's joy blinds her to his fear. For her, this is salvation, not a misunderstanding but destiny fulfilled. Meanwhile, above ground, Victoria waits in her bedroom, staring out at the moon. The contrast between her and Emily couldn't be sharper. One wrapped in pale lace and loneliness, the other wrapped in decay yet vibrant with emotion. Burton balances them like two mirrors reflecting different kinds of captivity. Victoria's parents, cold and self-absorbed, care only that the wedding proceed, and when Victor disappears, they interpret as humiliation. Desperate to salvage their reputation, they welcome the arrival of a mysterious newcomer, Lord Burton, who presents himself as a gentleman of means. His smile hides calculation. He flatters Victoria's parents, claiming kinship with nobility. We, the viewers, sense danger immediately, the glint in his eyes, the rehearsed charm. He's a parasite the film warned us about, greed wearing gloves. Down below, Victor concocts a plan to return to the living world. He persuades Emily to accompany him to see Elder Gough, claiming he wishes to introduce her properly to his parents. In truth, he hopes to escape. Elder Gough performs a ritual, a bubbling potion of green smoke and rhyme, that briefly allows the dead to cross into the land of the living. The moment the color drains again and the fog returns, Victor sprints toward home. The chase is thrilling in its irony, the living fleeing from love, the dead chasing it. Emily follows, hurt but devoted. When they reach the Van Dort mansion, chaos erupts. Victor's parents faint. Servants scream. Emily stands glowing blue amid the drab wallpaper. She looks around at chandeliers and portraits as if seeing the cruelty of life more clearly now. For a fleeting second, she looks almost happy. She's home again, but not hers. Victor hides in shame. Victoria, hearing the commotion, rushes toward him, and in that electric instant, the two worlds collide. Emily sees the tenderness between them, the same tenderness she once dreamed of. The hurt on her face is quiet but devastating. Without anger, she vanishes back into the graveyard's mist, leaving Victor hollowed by guilt. What follows is silence, the kind that sits in your chest after you've hurt someone kind by accident. Victor returns to the woods, kneeling by the spot where she first rose, whispering apologies that vanish into night air. The camera lingers on the flicker of his candle, the symbol of conscience. For a film filled with skeletons and ghosts, its most haunting moments are the pauses, when a man alone in the dark realizes he's broken something that believed in him. Parallel to his remorse, Victoria faces her own imprisonment. Her parents announce her engagement to Lord Burton without her consent. She pleads that Victor is alive, that she loves him, but her voice is drowned out by her mother's brittle pride. Locked in her room, she peers through the bars and sees the town preparing for a new wedding. It's cruelly familiar, decorations recycled, music rehearsed again. Only this time, the bride's heart is missing. The living world repeats its rituals like a broken music box, indifferent to meaning. By the midpoint of the story, we've watched both Victor and Victoria lose control of their fates, while Emily, paradoxically, begins to awaken to her own agency. The irony is beautiful. Death teaches self-realization faster than life does. Burton crafts this inversion with wit, but also with deep empathy. Every character here is a reflection of fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of rejection, fear of loneliness. The underworld, with its chaos and laughter, becomes a metaphor for acceptance. The surface world, polished and gray, becomes a grave of manners. The first half ends a moment of reckoning. Victor, finally understanding the gravity of his vow, returns to the land of the dead not as a captive but as a penitent. He tells Emily he is willing to honor the promise and marry her properly, under the law of both worlds, even if it means joining her in death. It's not romantic in the traditional sense. It's moral. He can't bear to live knowing he betrayed someone who believed in him. The scene closes with Emily's eyes widening in astonishment and sorrow, her skeletal hand trembling as she realizes love can still be pure even when it's doomed. That's where the first half breathes out, on the threshold between sincerity and surrender. The next act will turn these choices into consequences, peeling back the deception behind Lorberkiss and showing how death itself can be redeemed through compassion. But up to this point, the film has already done what few live-action dramas manage. It's made the grotesque tender, the macabre humane, and the absurd meaningful. The living have never looked so lifeless, the dead never so alive. The second half of the film opens with a heartbeat that doesn't exist, yet somehow you feel it. Down in the underworld, candles flicker in colors that don't belong to life. Turquoise, lavender, a kind of blue that seems made of size. Victor stands there, pale and trembling, facing Emily. He's no longer just a frightened man. Something inside him has shifted. The first time he stumbled into this world, he wanted nothing more than to escape. Now he's come back of his own will. The dead cheer around him as if they witnessed the impossible. A living man returning voluntarily to the land of the forgotten. And in that moment, even before he speaks, you sense redemption threading through the gloom. Victor tells Emily he understands now. He made a vow, and whether the world above accepts it or not, he intends to keep it. His words are quiet, stripped of the nervous laughter that once followed him everywhere. He looks her in the eyes, those large, glassy eyes that seem carved from both sorrow and light, and says that if she still wishes it, he will marry her properly. The ceremony will be conducted by Elder Gutknecht in the church above, where vows can bind the living and the dead forever. His voice doesn't waver when he adds, "I will drink the poison and join you." It's the first time Victor's love feels active, not accidental. He's not running away from his mistakes. He's walking into them with grace. Emily's reaction is heartbreaking. For a moment, joy spreads across her face like dawn breaking over a cemetery. But it's a fragile joy, the kind that trembles under guilt. Deep down, she knows what this decision means. For her to be whole again, he must lose everything. When she looks at him, she sees both the man she loved long ago and the chance to let him go. Still, she agrees, not because she's cruel or desperate, but because hope makes fools of us all. The wedding is arranged for that night, under the same moon that witnessed her betrayal years ago. Meanwhile, above ground, the living prepare for a different wedding. Victoria, trapped in her silken sadness, stands before her parents as they finalize her marriage to Lord Burkiss-Bittern. The hypocrisy of it all is unbearable. She has just discovered Victor's supposed union with a corpse, and while her heart refuses to believe it, her parent insists that she must forget him. The Everglot's drawing room glimmers with chandeliers and deceit. Burkiss, in his polished coat, hides his greed behind gallantry. He promises them security, fortune, salvation from poverty, everything they crave except truth. His smile is rehearsed. His words smell of calculation. When Victoria agrees to the wedding, it isn't consent, it's resignation. She looks like a ghost long before she dies. Back in the underworld, preparations take on a kind of festive irony. The skeletal band tunes their instruments. Spirits hang garlands of ghostly flowers, and Gough rehearses the sacred rites. There's excitement in the air. The dead are eager to return to the land of the living, if only for a night. It's been so long since we've seen the old place. One of them sighs. It's funny and moving all at once. These souls, denied rest, finding joy in something as simple as an outing. Burton gives them humanity without heartbeat. The sequence where the dead rise again is one of the most visually haunting in all stop-motion cinema. Doors creak open in the town above. Graves split. Skeletons step out not as monsters but as memories. A child sees his long-lost grandfather and runs to embrace him. An old woman smiles as her husband, bones and all, tips his hat once more. The townsfolk screams fade into laughter as they realize the dead mean no harm. It's a moment of eerie reconciliation. The two worlds overlapping, old griefs dissolving into music. And there, among the confusion, Victor and Emily arrive at the church to wed. Victoria, having escaped her gilded cage, sees a procession through her window. The sight freezes her. A bridal march led by ghosts, a living groom walking hand in hand with death. She follows him through the fog, her gown dragging through mud, her heart split between disbelief and longing. When she reaches the church, she hides behind the pews, trembling as the ceremony begins. The priest stammers, unsure whether to sanctify or flee. Gough voice echoes like the turning of centuries. Victor kneels beside Emily. The vows begin. He repeats each word carefully, without fear now, as if every syllable were a confession. When the time comes for him to drink the wine, the poisoned chalice that will bind into her forever, his hand doesn't shake. He raises it to his lips. But just before he drinks, Emily stops him. Her hand closes over his, gentle but firm. In that pause, the entire film exhales. She looks at him with infinite tenderness and says, "I was a bride. My dreams were taken from me. But now you shall not suffer the same fate." Her voice breaks slightly, and you feel centuries of grief dissolve into clarity. For the first time, Emily sees love not as possession, but as release. She realizes that true affection is not about claiming someone, but setting them free. It's the moment the story ceases to be about death at all. It becomes a love letter to forgiveness. Lord Burkiss bursts in before the silence can settle. He storms down the aisle, enraged that the corpse he murdered now stands before him. His arrogance spills out in sneers. He reveals himself as Emily's killer, boasting that she was a fool with a fortune. The room gasps. Even the skeletons recoil. Victoria, hiding nearby, steps forward in horror. The truth snaps open like a wound. Burkiss, drunk on his own cruelty, seizes a poisoned cup from Victor's hand and toasts mockingly to eternal love. He drinks, and within seconds, the smirk falters. The poison takes hold. His skin pales, his knees buckle, and he falls lifeless at Emily's feet. The living man who killed for greed dies by his own hand. The dead step forward, encircling him. For a moment it seems they will tear him apart, vengeance glowing in their empty sockets. But Gough raises his hand, reminding them of the law. The newly dead belong to us, no longer bound by mortal chains. The irony is sublime. Burkiss, terrified, begs for mercy. Emily, her eyes calm now, looks at him without hatred. "You may go," she says softly, and as he's dragged away screaming into the shadows, she doesn't flinch. Her vengeance has turned to compassion. Then comes a quiet epilogue, the scene that lingers like perfume on old lace. The storm outside clears. Moonlight spills through the stained glass. Victor stands between two worlds again. Victoria alive, Emily unalive, and both bound to him in different ways. He turns toward Emily, bows slightly, and whispers, "Thank you." She smiles, not as a ghost, but as a woman finally at peace. Her form begins to shimmer, her gown dissolving into 1,000 blue butterflies that flutter upward, out the window, into the night. The sight is breathtaking, a symbol of release so simple and yet so transcendent it leaves you breathless. The church empties, leaving Victor and Victoria alone amid candlelight and silence. She steps toward him timidly, as though afraid to disturb the sacred air left behind. He takes her hand. They say nothing. The camera rises, showing the moon shining where Emily vanished. The final note on the piano plays, one solitary key, before fading into the hum of wind. That's how the film ends, not with triumph, but with understanding. The living learn compassion from the dead learn peace from the living. Every character has crossed a border between duty and desire, fear and acceptance, life and what lies beyond. And when the credits roll, you realize you've just witnessed one of the rare love stories where no one truly wins, yet everyone is redeemed. I often think about how Burton manages to make the story so emotionally resonant without resorting to melodrama. Everything is understated. The gestures, the humor, the heartbreak. The stop-motion technique itself forces restraint. Every expression must be deliberate, sculpted frame by frame. You can feel that care in Victor's nervous eyes, in Emily's flicker of doubt before she lets him go. Each motion is earned. In the second half especially, the film becomes a kind of waltz between souls rather than bodies. Every pivot of the plot, Victor's promise, Emily's release, Burkiss's downfall, follows a rhythm of moral symmetry. It's almost musical in structure. Tension builds, melody breaks. Resolution hums softly beneath the surface. What lingers after this act isn't the imagery of skeletons or the Gothic aesthetic. It's the moral architecture. The film tells us that love, stripped of ownership, becomes grace. That forgiveness is a kind of resurrection. And that sometimes the most beautiful unions are the ones that never happen because they teach us something more profound than fulfillment. They teach us dignity. In that sense, the ending isn't sad at all. It's luminous. Emily's departure isn't disappearance. It's ascension. She's finally free from the chains of betrayal and longing. Victor's courage restores her humanity, and her mercy restores his. Victoria's presence at the end completes the circle, the living inheriting wisdom from the dead. Even the setting transforms. What began as a lifeless gray town now glows with moonlight and color. The balance is restored. The second half of Corpse Bride carries a gentleness that few Gothic tales attempt. It doesn't revel in tragedy. It redeems it. There's humor tucked in the corners, but it never cheapens the sorrow. There's grief, but it never drowns the beauty. Every beat feels earned, every tear justified. By the time the last butterfly fades into the night, you feel as though you've just witnessed a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living who forget how to love bravely. If you pause Corpse Bride at almost any frame, what you see isn't merely a still from a Gothic animation. It's a portrait of loneliness disguised as elegance. Each character, no matter how skeletal or silent, carries an ache that feels startlingly human. When I look back on the film, I don't see caricatures carved from clay. I see people who mirror our own contradictions. Fear and tenderness, selfishness and sacrifice, love and cowardice. Victor Van Dort has always fascinated me because he is, at his core, an accidental pilgrim. He begins the story as someone who wishes simply not to embarrass himself, a timid man rehearsing vows he doesn't yet understand. There's a gentle absurdity in his nervousness, the way his hands fidget as if morality itself were fragile glass he might drop. Yet under that nervous energy is purity. He means every word he stumbles through. What makes Victor so relatable is his sincerity's clumsiness. He wants to do good but has no idea how. When he inadvertently proposes to Emily, that mistake becomes the film's most poetic irony. Only a man pure enough to mean what he says could awaken a love that death itself had silenced. As the story progresses, Victor evolves in quiet increments. His transformation is not heroic in the cinematic sense. There's no sudden burst of courage or violent rebellion, but rather spiritual. The living world teaches him propriety. The dead teach him authenticity. Surrounded by skeletons who laugh at their own bones, he learns that being alive is more than having a pulse. It's daring to care. By the final act, when he offers to drink poison to honor his vow, it isn't submission, it's self-knowledge. He has finally understood what commitment costs. His trembling hands, once symbols of fear, become instruments of resolve. And that's what makes Victor memorable. He grows not by conquering others, but by conquering hesitation. Emily, the titular Corpse Bride, is perhaps Tim Burton's most delicate creation, a spirit stitched together from tragedy and grace. She is simultaneously ghost and girl, vengeance and virtue, humor and heartbreak. Her design alone tells her story. One eye wide and luminous, the other half closed as if still morning, a veil that floats like breath, skin that glows blue, hinting that sorrow can have its own light. The brilliance of Emily lies in how she embodies contradictions. She is both a horror and a heart of the film. When she first rises from the ground, she appears terrifying. When she speaks, she sounds like longing itself. Emily's character arc is the film's quiet soul. She begins by mistaking possession for love, believing Victor's accidental vow is the salvation she'd been waiting for. But through him, she learns what true love demands, the willingness to let the beloved go. That final act of release, when she stops Victor from drinking the poison, transforms her from victim to redeemer. In that moment, she transcends both death and heartbreak. She becomes a moral compass for everyone else in the story, the embodiment of the idea that love purified a desire turns into compassion. I've often thought of her as Burton's angel of decay. She reminds us that even in ruin, beauty can still forgive. Then there's Victoria Everglot, the living bride who, in a less thoughtful film, would have been merely the proper alternative to Emily's wildness. But Burton refuses to make her a symbol of bland virtue. Victoria is fragile, yes, but not weak. Her quiet rebellion, reading forbidden romances, believing in kindness amid cruelty, feels subversive in her repressed world. She lives in a house filled with chandeliers but devoid of warmth, parents who treat her future like currency. When Victor vanishes, she's the only one who believes in his innocence. Her courage is subtle. She resists without violence, defies without spectacle. In a society that prizes silence, she dares to feel. Victoria's presence completes the moral triangle at the film center. Victor represents uncertainty, Emily represents passion, and Victoria represents patience. He is caught between two forms of love, one that burns in the afterlife and one that waits in life. Yet both women reflect pieces of the same lesson. Love requires choice, and choice requires integrity. Victoria's endurance makes Emily's sacrifice meaningful. Emily's sacrifice makes Victoria's love possible. When the two finally share that silent acknowledgement in the church, their eyes meeting across worlds, it feels less like rivalry and more like recognition. They understand each other. It's one of the rare cinematic moments where two heroines connected to the same man share not jealousy, but empathy. Surrounding these three central figures is a gallery of supporting souls who bring balance to the story's darkness. Pastor Galswell's, stiff as a tombstone, stands for the living world's obsession with propriety. His every word is a sermon against spontaneity. Yet even he is outshone by the absurdity of the Everglots, Victoria's parents, who embody the decaying aristocracy, wealthy in name, impoverished in spirit. They speak in sneers and sighs, moving like mannequins desperate to stay relevant. Their greed is almost comedic, but it's precisely that exaggeration that makes the film's moral landscape clear. The truly lifeless are not underground but seated at dinner tables above it. Lord Bittern, on the other hand, is the mirror image of Victor, confidence without conscience. He is the sort of man Victorian society celebrates, charming, articulate, ambitious. Yet every smile he offers is counterfeit. His motivations are purely transactional. He wants wealth, not warmth, a bride, not love. It's easy to despise him, but what makes him interesting is how he reveals the hypocrisy of the living. The world that mocks Emily's corpse embraces Burkiss's corruption. When he's finally dragged into the afterlife, it feels less like punishment and more like natural balance being restored. His death restores a moral order that the living had abandoned. Elder Gutknecht is a delightful contradiction, a skeletal sage whose wisdom sounds both ancient and absurd. His role, though small, adds mythic weight. He bridges the two realms, showing that the dead aren't vengeful but curious, longing for music of life. Then there's Bone Jangles, the jazzy storyteller whose song about Emily's murder injects rhythm into tragedy. He's proof of Burton's gift for using humor as compassion. The song isn't mockery but remembrance. Every skeleton tapping its toes is celebrating memory itself. Even the nameless extras, like the maggot who lives in Emily's head and quotes Shakespeare, carry depth. They turn what could have been grotesque into affectionate parody. Through them, Death becomes communal, a place of acceptance rather than fear. It's a beautiful inversion of life's loneliness. What I love most is how the characters' physical appearances mirror their emotional states. The living are pale, narrow, restrained, their movements mechanical, as though etiquette has petrified them. The dead, paradoxically, are expressive and colorful, their bones swaying with freedom. Burton uses exaggeration not for shock, but for symbolism. Our emotional life, or death, depends on honesty, not biology. The more these characters embrace truth, the more alive they seem, regardless of heartbeat. The relationship dynamics between Victor, Emily, and Victoria form the emotional trinity of the film. Victor's journey is a thread, but the women are the fabric. Emily's world teaches him depth. Victoria's world teaches him continuity. The film refuses to vilify either choice because both represent essential parts of love. Emily embodies passion's transcendence. She teaches Victor how to feel. Victoria embodies commitment's steadiness. She teaches him how to live. By the end, when Emily releases him and Victoria takes his hand, it doesn't feel like replacement. It feels like succession. One love ends so another can begin, purified through loss. There's also something deeply literary about the way Burton constructs these characters. They echo archetypes from Gothic novels and romantic poetry. Emily as a Byronic spectre doomed affection. Victor as the indecisive dreamer reminiscent of a Shelleyan hero. Victoria as a virtuous heart that redeems despair. But instead of using them as static symbols, he gives them humor. The absurdity softens the melancholy, making them accessible without diluting their mythic quality. And then there's a collective spirit of the dead, a chorus of acceptance. They treat Emily's heartbreak not with pity, but with companionship. They dance, they sing, they drink glowing brews, reminding us that even in death community heals. That, too, is a character in itself. The underworld is a living organism, warm and self-aware. It contrasts sharply with the sterile solitude of the living, where every dinner conversation is a negotiation. The dead have nothing left to hide, and that honesty gives them joy. In the end, what binds all these characters is longing for connection, for redemption, for truth. Whether it's Victor's search for courage, Emily's hunger for justice, or Victoria's quiet plea for love, each of them embodies a facet of the same desire, to be seen. And that's the film's emotional secret. Underneath its Victorian gloom and skeletal humor lies a simple, human craving for recognition. When I think of them now, I picture Victor's trembling hand resting over Emily's skeletal one, and Victoria watching from the shadows, her eyes full of sympathy rather than envy. Three people divided by worlds, but united by understanding. Burton gives them the dignity of complexity. No villainy for the sake of plot, no perfection for the sake of comfort. They all stumble, they all hurt, and in their vulnerability, they all glow. And perhaps that's why Corpse Bride remains timeless. It teaches through character what most films try to preach through dialogue, that our worth is measured not by how long we live, but by how deeply we love. Each character, living, dead, or somewhere between, becomes a verse in that darkly beautiful poem. And when the final scene fades, you don't just remember them. You feel them lingering like a half-forgotten song echoing through the corridors of conscience. There's something deliciously peculiar about a film like Corpse Bride. The deeper you look into its making, the more it begins to feel like a seance between art, technology, and obsession. Every frame carries a whisper from someone who refused to settle for ordinary. It isn't merely an animated feature. It's a cathedral of strange facts, each one stitched into the film's fabric like embroidery that only shows its shimmer when light hits it from a right angle. I've always thought the oddest truths about this movie are the ones that explain why it feels so strangely alive, how a story about the dead ended up pulsing with so much humanity. Let's start with the puppets themselves. There were more than 300 individual puppets built for the film, a small population of ghosts, skeletons, and townsfolk who required their own wardrobe skeleton rigs and tiny screws inside their heads to express emotion. The engineers developed micromechanical skulls, each fitted with minute gears no bigger than a grain of rice. By turning these, animators could adjust the position of a single eyelid or raise an eyebrow fraction of a millimeter. Emily alone had over 28 replaceable faceplates, allowing her to smile, frown, mourn, or glow with tenderness, and each plate had to align perfectly so her face never cracked at the seam. Imagine the patience that required. Every blink, every tear, carved and moved by hand. The strangeness grows when you realize how cutting-edge it was for its time. Corpse Bride became the first stop-motion feature shot entirely with digital still cameras, abandoning traditional film reels. They used Canon EOS 1D Mark II cameras, shooting frame by frame into a computer, which gave them unprecedented control over lighting and continuity. Each second of film required 24 individual photographs. A single animator could produce maybe 3 seconds of footage in a full day's work. There's something both insane and spiritual about that pace. The devotion of monastic artists laboring over seconds that most viewers blink through. And yet, the film's atmosphere, that lush combination of gloom and shimmer, came from an entirely physical world. Burton refused to rely heavily on post-production trickery. The fog was cotton tees under lights, the moon a painted disk, the water simulated through layers of glass. Even the glowing butterflies in the final scene were animated by hand. Tiny translucent cutouts moved millimeter by millimeter. It's almost comical to imagine a team of adults hunched over tables pushing clay wings across black velvet, while orchestral music played in the background. But that's what gave the film its warmth. Imperfection sculpted into poetry. One of the strangest facts concerns Emily's color palette. That ethereal blue glow wasn't just an artistic whim. It was designed after phosphorescent deep-sea creatures. The art team studied jellyfish and anglerfish to capture a light that looked both organic and unearthly. They coated her with thin layers of paint mixed with crushed glass powder, so she'd catch light like dew. Under the set lamps, her skin actually sparkled faintly. So what we see on screen is not digital. It's real reflected light on a miniature body. That knowledge changes how I watch her now. When she turns her head, the shimmer that passes across her cheek isn't computer work. It's craftsmanship glowing in the dark. Another odd truth. The animators nicknamed Victor's puppet Shaky because his neck joint would tremble under camera heat. Rather than fix it completely, Burton loved the quirk. He thought it made Victor seem more nervous, more human. They adjusted the storyboards to exaggerate that twitch. So a technical flaw became a defining trait. It's a wonderful example of artistic alchemy, turning error into identity. Helena Bonham Carter, who voiced Emily, reportedly sang parts of her dialogue live on set during rehearsals to sync emotion with breath movement in the puppet. The animators would watch her facial muscles frame by frame to imitate the tremble in her voice. Johnny Depp, recording Victor's lines, took the opposite approach. He whispered many of them, almost inaudible to the microphone, forcing the engineers to amplify every breath. Burton wanted the two performances to contrast. Emily's voice flowing like wind through a tomb, Victor's voice like a candle trying not to go out. Perhaps the most haunting anecdote is that the story itself draws from a 19th century Russian Jewish folktale. In that legend, a man jokingly places his wedding ring on the finger of a corpse sticking out of ground, unwittingly marrying her spirit. Burton's team found it in a collection of Eastern European ghost stories and adapted it with Victorian sensibility. But here's the curious twist. The original folktale ends with the corpse claiming her husband forever. Burton and his co-writer John August reversed it, letting the dead bride release the living one. The inversion transforms folklore's punishment into redemption, which is perhaps why the film feels strangely uplifting. It takes a story born in fear and turns it into grace. There's a surreal trivia thread about how the production physically resembled its own theme of dual worlds. On one half of the studio lot were the living sets, all gray tones, angular furniture, narrow corridors. On the other half, separated by only a black curtain, were the dead sets, flooded with color, rounded shapes, glowing lights. Animators joked that walking from one side to the other felt like dying and being reborn every day. Some even decorated their desks with fake tombstones to keep track of which department they belonged to. The piano duet scene carries its own strangeness. The tiny piano was a fully functional instrument, meticulously built to scale with 88 working keys. When Emily and Victor play together, the animators synchronize their finger movements to actual notes. They filmed a professional pianist's hands performing the piece and then replicated every keystroke on the puppet piano. It took 6 weeks to animate those few seconds. 6 weeks for a moment that passes like a sigh, but it's that precision that makes the scene feel genuine. You can almost sense the rhythm between them because it existed in real space. Danny Elfman's musical involvement adds another layer of uncanny charm. Not only did he compose the entire score, but he also voiced Bone Jangles, the jazzy skeleton who narrates Emily's backstory. The song Remains of the Day was recorded with live jazz musicians to preserve the improvisational energy. Elfman wanted the dead to sound looser than the living, so the orchestra in those scenes was intentionally recorded in a slightly echoing studio to create the feel of a barroom in the afterlife. The living scenes, by contrast, were scored with tight chamber strings recorded in a soundproof room. You can actually hear the difference if you listen closely. The world above sounds suffocated. The world below breathes. Even the props hide curious details. The Everglot Mansion, for instance, was built with deliberately crooked staircases that forced puppets to tilt at odd angles, mirroring the emotional imbalance of that household. Emily's bouquet contains dried forget-me-nots, painted with metallic flecks, so they catch the light only when she's near Victor, a subtle cue linking their connection to memory rather than flesh. And the crows in the opening scene? They're mechanical puppets with actual feathers glued one by one, plucked from vintage hats found in London thrift shops. A darker but fascinating tidbit. Many of the crew who had previously worked on A Nightmare Before Christmas described Corpse Bride as Burton's mirror film. Whereas Nightmare celebrated misfits through exuberance, Corpse Bride explores them through melancholy. The two productions even shared a few puppets, modified and repainted. One of the skeletal musicians in the underworld is literally Jack Skellington's armature under a new skull. You could call it cameo of bones. Then there's the eerie coincidence that the film's production overlapped with Burton's work on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He was directing both simultaneously, commuting between live-action chaos and stop-motion tranquility. The contrast shows in the mood. While Charlie bursts with color and cynicism, Corpse Bride whispers sadness through elegance. Some crew members joke that Burton lived between two worlds just like Victor, flesh by day, phantom by night. Even the technological accidents became part of the lore. During filming, a computer crash once erased an entire day sequence. The animators reshot it from memory the next morning and discovered the lighting had subtly changed. Rather than discard it, Burton kept both versions, layering the two exposures to create a faint shimmer, visible when Emily walks through moonlight. What began as catastrophe turned into beauty, a digital ghost haunting the final print. Helena Bonham Carter later admitted she recorded several scenes while heavily pregnant, her belly pressing against the microphone stand. She joked that Emily's emotional breathiness came from running out of air between takes. Johnny Depp, meanwhile, described Victor as Charlie Chaplin trapped in a Gothic poem, a line so strange and perfect that Burton adopted it for promotional interviews. Another oddity lies in the puppets' materials. Their bones weren't clay at all, but silicone rubber over metal skeletons, giving them flexibility unheard of in earlier stop motion. Yet their clothing was actual fabric, sewn under microscopes with needles thin enough to break after a few stitches. One seamstress said she felt like a mortician dressing corpses. She even used tiny corsets to make sure wrinkles fell naturally. Watching the film now, every fold of Emily's dress feels like a size sewn into silk. There's a rumor, unconfirmed but irresistible, that one of the animators left a miniature coffee cup hidden inside the Everglot kitchen set as a joke. It's invisible on screen, but apparently Burton found it and insisted it stay, calling it a ghost breakfast. No one ever located it again after the set was dismantled. Somewhere in the storage unit, a tiny porcelain mug probably still sits among cobwebs. The strangeness continues in how the team captured emotional realism. Because stop motion lacks natural blur between frames, the animators physically smeared Vaseline on glass to simulate motion blur during fast movements. That handmade blur gives scenes like Emily's twirl or Victor's run to the woods a ghostly smoothness that computers couldn't replicate then. The imperfection creates soul. Even the decision to cast the living world in muted grayscale and the dead world in neon hues came from a philosophical whim. Burton told the cinematographer he wanted the land of the living to look like it's already dead. They used real-world desaturation by painting sets with gray pigments rather than filtering them digitally. When you see color in the living world, it's actually dull paint. When you see glow in the underworld, it's real luminescence bouncing off miniature mirrors. The production became a visual thesis about perception. Maybe we see more clearly when we stop breathing. And then there's a butterfly motif. Deceptively simple, deeply strange. Those butterflies at the end weren't random symbols of rebirth. Burton conceived them after finding a dead butterfly in a studio during early concept sketches. He pinned it to his wall and noticed that under light it still shimmered faintly. That contradiction, something dead reflecting beauty, became the emotional spine of the film. He asked the art team to design every keyframe of Emily's transformation around that single observation. In one sense, the entire movie exists because of that one insect. Another fact almost nobody notices. Each time Victor interacts with Emily, a candle nearby either flickers or extinguishes. It's not digital symbolism. Technicians manually controlled every flame using concealed air tubes. That physical choreography of light makes their connection tangible. Love altering the environment itself. Watching closely, you can see tiny gusts ripple through the air like sighs. And perhaps the strangest, most poetic trivia of all. When the film premiered, a small section of the audience wept not at the ending but at the credits. Why? Because they listed nearly 60 individual animators, each credited not by department but by name, acknowledging that for the first time in Burton's history, the invisible hands behind the magic would be immortalized. In a film about forgotten souls, even the creators refuse to remain ghosts. What all these odd truths reveal is that Corpse Bride is a paradox disguised as entertainment. Its strangest facts are also its most human. It's a film made of contradictions, analog yet digital, macabre yet tender, technical yet spiritual. It was built by hundreds of artists who spent years breathing life into clay, only to create a story reminding us that death is just another shade of being alive. When I rewatch it now, every flicker, every imperfection, every glint of dust feels intentional, as if the movie itself were winking from between worlds, whispering that sometimes the strangest thing about the dead is how honestly they live. When Corpse Bride arrived in theaters in 2005, it seemed to appear like an echo, not loud or attention-seeking, but resonant, quietly humming to the corridors of cinema that had grown too polished for their own good. This was the age when digital animation was flexing its muscles, when every studio was chasing the next sleek, computer-rendered spectacle. Pixar had already changed the landscape. DreamWorks was busy turning fairy tales into pop culture playgrounds. And then Tim Burton, ever the elegant outsider, offered something that looked older than the medium itself, a stop-motion waltz between life and death, scored with melancholy and light. Critics at first didn't quite know what to do with it. It was too delicate to categorize, too moral to market, too poetic to package. But beneath the confusion, something deeper stirred. The film quietly reestablished stop-motion not as nostalgia, but as literature, a medium capable of feeling rather than flexing. To understand a critical response, you have to imagine what it meant for Burton to follow his own shadow. 12 years earlier, he had produced A Nightmare Before Christmas, and the world had claimed it as his magnum opus. Corpse Bride was therefore judged not as an experiment, but as a sequel of Spirit. Early reviews fixated on the comparison, some praising it as a mature companion piece, others dismissing it as repetition. But what many critics missed is that Corpse Bride isn't a mirror of Nightmare. It's its elegy. If Nightmare celebrated the outsider's rebellion, Corpse Bride mourned the cost of belonging. It shifted Burton's tone from carnival to requiem. Roger Ebert's review, gentle and perceptive, noted that the film's heart beats under the floorboards of convention, praising its moral tenderness more than its spectacle. Others, like the New York Times, called it beautifully sad, emphasizing its emotional restraint. There was an undercurrent of surprise, as if critics had expected whimsy and received grace instead. And indeed, what makes a movie enduringly fascinating isn't its gothic design or musical charm, but its ethical architecture. It's a film about promises, consent, and redemption. Words rarely apply to animation then. Academics and film scholars began years later to read Corpse Bride as part of Burton's personal mythology, a trilogy of sorts with Edward Scissorhands and Big Fish, all orbiting the idea of alienation reconciled through love. They argued that Emily represents a feminine principle of forgiveness that redeems Burton's often misunderstood male archetypes. Victor's journey is less a romance than an awakening, the realization that love cannot thrive in fear's shadow. Seen this way, Corpse Bride functions almost like a parable. The afterlife is not hell but honesty. The real punishment is living without truth. In cultural context, the movie landed at a curious moment. The early 2000s were soaked in irony. Sincerity was almost unfashionable. But Corpse Bride dared to be sincere. Its humor wasn't sarcastic. It was compassionate. Its macabre was a rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was tenderness wearing bones. Critics from Europe picked up on this more quickly than Americans did. French reviewers called it uncanny mordigise and fantôme, a moral tale disguised as a ghost story. The British press admired its craftsmanship, but it was Eastern European critics who recognized their own folktale DNA in it, tracing it back to Jewish mysticism and the Slavic legends of the Finger Bride. They saw not just a film, but a reclamation, folklore finally treated with dignity rather than exoticism. In the years since, Corpse Bride has developed an aura that transcends its release. Scholars have called it Burton's romantic theology. They mean that the film proposes a worldview where love isn't a transaction between two bodies, but a covenant between souls, and that death, instead of negating it, reveals its truest form. That reading may sound grandiose, but it's difficult to watch Emily's final scene and not sense a spiritual dimension. Her ascension isn't just closure, it's transcendence earned through forgiveness. Some theologians even compare it to Orpheus and Eurydice inverted, where the woman releases a man from the underworld instead of being abandoned there. Another line of criticism situates the film within feminist discourse. Emily, though dead, owns her narrative. She is not merely an object of pity, but a moral agent who chooses mercy. The act of letting Victor live transforms her from victim to redeemer, a reversal of patriarchal myth in which women usually suffer from men's growth. Victoria, meanwhile, subverts the good girl stereotype by showing quiet resistance rather than blind obedience. Together, they outline two forms of strength, defiant and dignified, converging at the film's conclusion. The critical consensus today often celebrates this subtle duality as Burton's most mature treatment of female characters. Yet for all its moral weight, the film's critical story is also a story of craftsmanship winning over cynicism. Many reviewers who began skeptical ended up awed by its visual poetry. Animation historian Charles Solomon called it a hymn to human touch, noting that in an age of synthetic perfection, every imperfection in Corpse Bride feels like a fingerprint. Others marveled at how light itself becomes a character, a form of moral presence that separates the living from the dead, the sincere from the hollow. At festivals, the film played almost like a curiosity, a small stop-motion feature competing quietly against digital giants. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival, and while it didn't sweep awards, it left critics murmuring about the resurrection of tactile cinema. The Los Angeles Times described audiences applauding not during the credits, but at the end of Emily's transformation, an emotional applause, spontaneous and quiet. Those who saw it on the big screen remember how the butterflies shimmered against the black, as though the theater itself had been visited by spirits. Burton's own relationship with critics was ambivalent. He rarely explains himself, preferring mystery to clarity. When asked whether the film was about death or love, he smiled and said, "They're the same thing. One reveals the other." That ambiguity has fueled 2 decades of essays, lectures, and think pieces dissecting Corpse Bride through lenses as varied as Gothic revivalism, postmodern nostalgia, and existential romanticism. Some even see it as Burton's meditation on artistic creation, animating dead material into something meaningful. It's not a stretch. After all, stop-motion animators are literally giving motion to the lifeless. Among fans, the film became a sort of cult comfort. While it never achieved the mainstream commercial power of Nightmare Before Christmas, it settled deeper into personal collections, rewatched quietly rather than celebrated loudly. People who found it young often describe growing up and realizing it wasn't about ghosts at all. It was about the pain of being misunderstood. That generational rediscovery has given it new life. On social media, countless viewers post a piano duet scene with captions like, "This is how love sounds when words fail." Critics who once found it too slow now call it timeless. There's an interesting paradox in how Corpse Bride influenced later cinema. It didn't spark an immediate wave of stop-motion imitators. Instead, it changed the emotional vocabulary of animation itself. Studios like Leica, Coraline, Paranorman took cues from Burton's blend of melancholy and wonder, proving that family films could whisper instead of shout. You can trace his DNA in everything from Kubo and the Two Strings to Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, each echoing the belief that animation could be gothic without being grotesque. Burton's film gave permission for sadness to be beautiful. The movie events surrounding its release are just as peculiar. It premiered within weeks of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, another Burton-Depp collaboration, leading many to call 2005 the year of Burton. The contrast between the two films fascinated critics. One vibrant and loud, the other muted and poetic. Some argue that Corpse Bride was a real emotional successor to Edward Scissorhands, while Charlie catered to spectacle. Burton himself admitted he preferred the intimacy of puppets to the unpredictability of actors. He said half-jokingly, "Clay doesn't talk back." Behind the scenes, the movie's slow, tactile creation became a critical talking point. When journalists visited the set, they found dozens of miniature graveyards, hundreds of lights, and a crew that referred to themselves as puppet parents. This became part of its myth, the notion that it was made by people who literally lived with the characters for years. Critics often contrasted this dedication with Hollywood's obsession with speed. It reminded them of an earlier era of cinema, when art was crafted by hand rather than assembled by algorithm. Some critical essays also drew parallels between Corpse Bride and literature, comparing it to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, to Shelley's Frankenstein, even to Goethe's Faust. They noted how Victor's moral crisis mirrors the romantic hero's dilemma, the pursuit of purity through error. Others analyzed its narrative structure as an allegory of class, the living world as Victorian capitalism, the underworld as liberated community. The dead, free from social hierarchy, dance and sing, while the living suffocate in etiquette. Underneath its love story, Corpse Bride quietly dismantles the myth of aristocratic virtue. And perhaps the most revealing critical observation came years later, when film scholars began to connect Burton's imagery to his own psyche. The blue of Emily's skin, the thin trees, the moon always watching, all recurring symbols from his art notebooks. To them, Corpse Bride was his self-portrait disguised as fairy tale, a man afraid of perfection, choosing instead to love imperfection into eternity. Critics who once labeled his work Gothic whimsy began to recognize its spiritual core. Burton, they realized, wasn't obsessed with death. He was obsessed with persistence of feeling. Audience reactions mirrored this evolution. While children were charmed by the skeleton band and slapstick humor, adults found themselves unexpectedly moved. I've spoken with people who confess that Emily's final smile changed how they viewed love itself, that the act of letting go felt more romantic than any kiss. Online discussions decades later still debate whether Victor truly loved Emily, or if his affection was gratitude disguised as devotion. The fact that such a question endures is testament to the film's subtlety. It refuses neat closure, inviting perpetual reflection. In film retrospectives, Corpse Bride often appears as the quiet masterpiece, the one that whispered instead of screamed, and therefore survived longer in the heart. Critics who revisit it now tend to write about its restraint, its elegance, its refusal to exploit emotion for spectacle. Many have called it a literary film disguised as animation, meaning it values silence as much as speech, rhythm as much as revelation. Burton's fingerprint are on every shadow, but the movie's soul belongs to its moral vision, the belief that redemption, even after death, is still possible. And that's perhaps why the film's critical afterlife has been more vibrant than its box office. It has become a text for classrooms, a subject of essays, a metaphor in love letters, a mood board for artists, a comfort for those who've lost something or someone. Its music continues to haunt playlists, its imagery to inspire tattoos and wedding themes. Emily has become a symbol not of morbidity, but of grace, proof that beauty can survive betrayal. In a world obsessed with resurrection through spectacle, Corpse Bride achieved resurrection through empathy. That's its ultimate critical triumph. It reminded audiences and reviewers alike that cinema, even at its strangest, is still about the pulse behind the puppet, the human hand moving the lifeless frame into motion. Burton didn't just direct a film about death. He directed proof that love, like art, never truly stops breathing. It just changes its form. Every film tells two stories, the one we see and the one whispered behind the camera. With Corpse Bride, those whispers sound like the gentle clicking of gears inside miniature skulls, the sigh of cotton fog under warm studio lights, and the laughter of artists who spent years living in darkness just to create light. To know how this film came into being is to understand that it was as much a resurrection as a production. It wasn't built by a studio chasing trends, but by a family of craftspeople following a shared dream to prove that stop motion, an art form often pronounced dead, could still breathe. Tim Burton began nurturing the idea while finishing Sleepy Hollow in 1999. A producer handed him a short story inspired by an old Jewish folktale, and something in its tragic simplicity caught his imagination. A man accidentally marries a corpse. It sounded absurd, even grotesque, but also strangely pure. Burton said later that he felt an immediate empathy with the dead bride. He saw in her not horror, but heartbreak. That's when the seed was planted. It would take years for it to grow into the blue, glimmering ghost we now know as Emily. The film's early development was like alchemy in slow motion. Burton had just begun working with his longtime collaborator Mike Johnson, who had directed sequences for James and the Giant Peach. Johnson would later call the project a madman's love letter to imperfection. Together, they gathered animators, designers, and fabricators who were veterans of the Nightmare Before Christmas. They set up shop not in Hollywood, but in 3 Mill Studios in East London, a labyrinthine complex that once housed gin distilleries. The irony delighted Burton. Spirits being reborn in a place once filled with spirits. Inside those brick walls, the team built 2 complete worlds from scratch. Each was handcrafted at 1/6 human scale, meaning an average puppet stood about 18 inches tall. Sets were constructed like dollhouses with removable walls, so cameras could slide through corridors like ghosts. The living world sets were angular and suffocating, full of straight lines and muted grays. The land of the dead, by contrast, pulsed with rounded edges, neon hues, and swinging lamps. One side of the studio buzzed with sepulchral stillness, the other throbbed with jazz. Animators would joke about dying whenever they crossed over to the colorful side. One of the most fascinating insights into production is how much physical reality lives inside those frames. The fog, for instance, wasn't digital. It was dry ice vapor funneled through narrow tubes hidden beneath the floorboards. The moon that watches over Victor and Emily was a painted disc the size of a car tire, backlit by LED panels to mimic lunar shimmer. Even the shadows dancing across the church floor during the final scene weren't computer-generated. Technicians moved small cutout shapes between the lights and the set to make them flicker organically. Every imperfection was handmade, and therefore alive. When it came to animation, the scale of control bordered on madness. Each puppet contained a metal armature of joints, screws, and ball bearings, so animators could move them in tiny increments and photograph every pose. On average, an animator could produce 3 seconds of usable footage per day. That means a blink took hours, a smile perhaps days. To help track emotion, they used detailed performance charts for every scene, noting the position of each eyebrow, finger, and shoulder. They even recorded their own facial expressions in mirrors to mimic subtle human reactions. The puppets became extensions of their animators, and vice versa. One of the most extraordinary technical breakthroughs came in the form of servomotor facial mechanisms. Instead of swapping entire heads, as had been done in earlier stop-motion films, engineers fitted the puppets with micro-gears inside the skulls, controlled by tiny Allen keys. This allowed animators to shift expressions more fluidly, creating subtleties in breathing, blinking, and speech that had never been seen in stop-motion before. Emily's eyes alone could perform over 50 different movements, and her tears, real droplets of glycerin, had to be placed frame by frame. The cinematography, led by Pete Kozaczek, played an equally vital role. They shot the entire film using digital still cameras, Canon EOS 1D Mark II, making Corpse Bride the first stop-motion feature to abandon traditional film stock. This gave unprecedented control over exposure, depth, and color temperature. Kozaczek used special lenses from the 1960s to capture the vintage glow Burton wanted, softening the edges while maintaining the miniature texture. The crew even built custom dolly rigs small enough to glide between tombstones and piano legs, achieving cinematic movement on a tiny scale. Lighting, in particular, was a symphony of precision. The team lit the living world with cold overhead lamps, creating hard shadows and flattened tones to evoke repression. The underworld, however, glowed from within. Every object seemed to emit its own light, as though joy itself were radioactive. Each set required hundreds of microbulbs, carefully placed to mimic candlelight. The color blue, associated with Emily, was deliberately achieved by bouncing light off reflective foil, rather than painting it digitally. This gave her glow a kind of breathing shimmer, the illusion that she pulsed with emotion. Even the sound design followed the same philosophy of tactile truth. Every footstep was created by hand. When Victor walks on cobblestone, what you're hearing is an animator tapping ceramic tiles with a pencil. When Emily's bones click, it's the sound of wooden sticks lightly knocking together. The underworld's laughter was layered with real human chuckles pitched up and down like instruments, turning the dead into a choir of joy. Danny Elfman, Burton's musical twin soul, wrote the score in less than 4 months. He composed with stop-motion rhythm in mind, meaning he scored not to motion but to stillness, allowing animators to choreograph movement to music afterward. The score mirrors the film's architecture, rigid strings for the living, jazzy brass for the dead. One lesser-known fact is that Elfman also voiced Bone Jangles, the jazz-singing skeleton, improvising half of his dialogue and character. The result was recorded in one take, a spontaneous burst of life from a ghost. The film's voice recording sessions reveal their own charm. Johnny Depp, voicing Victor, was in the middle of filming Charlie and the Chocolate Factory at the time. Burton would record him in London between takes, sometimes while Depp still wore makeup as Willy Wonka. Helena Bonham Carter, Emily, often recorded her lines late at night, her voice soft and cracked from fatigue. Burton loved the fragility it gave her character. The chemistry between them existed entirely in microphones, yet their performances aligned with uncanny intimacy. It's proof that emotion, not physical proximity, creates connection. Production designer Alex McDowell, who had worked on Fight Club, called the film architecture built from emotion. Every curve of Emily's dress, every arch in the church, was drawn to express feeling. The world above ground features strict vertical lines, a visual prison of manners. The underworld bursts with curves, suggesting freedom through imperfection. Even the doors are metaphors. In the living world, they're narrow and locked. Below, they swing wide open. That kind of design philosophy explains why the movie feels emotionally legible even without dialogue. The sets themselves are telling the story. The making of Corpse Bride also carried a kind of spiritual rhythm for the team. Animators worked in near silence, each on a separate stage, communicating through handwritten notes pinned to puppet trays. They called themselves caretakers of moments. Every morning, they'd review the previous day's frames, often cheering when a small motion succeeded. When Emily blinked correctly for the first time, they reportedly applauded. The process took over 55 weeks of continuous animation, involving more than 100,000 individual frames captured by hand. Fun facts from the studio became legends over time. One animator secretly added a miniature spider in different positions across sets, moving it each week like a hidden signature, a ghostly Easter egg no one noticed until months after release. Another placed a photograph of his late grandmother inside a puppet's coffin as a tribute. Burton, when told, insisted the shot stay in the final cut, saying, "Then she belongs to the world now." These tiny acts of devotion give the film its strange warmth. It's not just made, it's inhabited. Emily's design process deserves its own mythology. Concept artist Carlos Grangel based her on Victorian mourning dolls, but he wanted her to look luminous rather than ghastly. Her blue palette came after weeks of testing. Early versions were pale gray, but under lighting they looked too lifeless. The team studied the transparency of butterfly wings to simulate her ghostly glow. Her eyes, the largest in Burton's canon, were designed to always catch two reflections of light, one from above, one from within, giving her that perpetual teary shimmer. Victor's puppet, on the other hand, was built to resemble a sketch Burton had drawn decades earlier of a boy with sad piano eyes. His slender frame was engineered with long, flexible limbs to exaggerate awkwardness. Animators studied Charlie Chaplin's silent gestures to give Victor's movements a rhythm of humility and panic. Every time his hand twitches, it's partly accidental. The joints in his puppet were intentionally looser than others to maintain that nervous realism. Another production quirk. The crew used human hair for Emily's wig, individually threaded into a silicone scalp. To make it float like underwater silk, they suspended it with invisible wires adjusted frame by frame. In scenes where she spins or dances, the hair's motion was choreographed separately by a hair animator. It's wild to imagine that there was a job whose sole purpose was to make a ghost's hair mourn gracefully. During post-production, Burton insisted that no scene be color-corrected digitally. He wanted a handmade feel preserved, including the occasional flicker of lighting or dust speck caught in frame. He said those imperfections remind the audience that what they're seeing is real. That philosophy ran through every department. Even the credits were shot as miniature scrolls unfurling in candlelight, rather than generated by computer text. The cast's chemistry bled beyond the screen. Helena Bonham Carter and Johnny Depp shared such trust under Burton's direction that much of their recorded dialogue was improvised in tone, half-whispered pauses, unfinished sentences, sighs. These unscripted breaths became the heartbeat of the film. Burton later said that the beauty of stop motion lies in those imperfections. A human trying to animate a ghost and failing beautifully. Even the editing room held stories. Chris LeBenson, Burton's frequent editor, had to synchronize multiple camera feeds manually because digital workflows were still new. He described it as editing ghosts on a typewriter. The entire film's data occupied less space than a single modern hard drive today, yet it contains a universe. Financially, Corpse Bride was an extravagant production. With a budget of roughly $40 million, it cost less than half of most CGI films of its time. Yet every dollar shows. It grossed nearly $120 million worldwide, proving that artistry could still hold commercial weight. But Burton never chased numbers. His victory was cultural. He had revived stop motion from niche curiosity to artistic relevance. Among the lesser-known crew was a small group of sculptors who built replacement limbs, alternate arms and legs for when puppets wore out from friction. One of them, reportedly exhausted, began referring to the disassembled parts as the boneyard. That name caught on, and soon the crew started throwing small Friday gatherings there, drinking tea among puppet limbs while jazz played in the background. They said it felt like celebrating with the characters themselves. Perhaps the most touching insight of all, when filming wrapped, Burton walked through each miniature set one last time before they were dismantled. He reportedly touched Emily's piano and said softly, "Thank you." It wasn't ceremony. It was gratitude. He believed that the puppets had souls, that they absorbed the care poured into them. And maybe that's why, when we watch the film, we feel something almost supernatural. Those little clay figures carry not just movement, but memory. In the end, the production of Corpse Bride stands as one of cinema's great contradictions. A film about death brought to life by obsession, sorrow sculpted into joy. Every fun fact, every technical miracle, every quiet human gesture behind the scenes becomes part of its ghostly charm. When the credits fade, it's easy to imagine the crew still there, hundreds of invisible hands adjusting a collar, polishing a skull, coaxing one more heartbeat from a puppet that refuses to stop living. The first thing that arrests you about Corpse Bride is its world. How it breathes despite being made of dust and wire. How every frame looks like a dream painted with ash and candlelight. The setting is not just backdrop, it's soul. In Burton's hands, architecture, light, and even silence become characters. This film doesn't take place in a town. It unfolds in a mood, a narrow, grieving, 19th century dusk where reality and reverie overlap. To describe it is to describe a feeling. The cold weight of manners pressing on the living, and the soft blue warmth of freedom glowing beneath the earth. The land of the living, as the crew called it, feels embalmed. Its palette is a suffocating range of grays and slate blues, punctuated occasionally by the yellow flame of a candle or the timid blush of a cheek. Streets are lined with crooked chimneys and thin houses that lean away from each other like people afraid of intimacy. The air seems heavy, filled with chalk dust and etiquette. Everything is vertical, rigid, and tight. The doors, the windows, even the posture of the townsfolk. Their movements are mechanical, as though politeness has calcified into anatomy. Every corner seems to whisper, "Don't disturb the quiet." It's the perfect visual metaphor for a world obsessed with appearances but devoid of warmth. Inside the Everglot mansion, walls stretch high and narrow, trapping sound like a coffin traps air. Shadows cut across the wallpaper in harsh geometric stripes, echoing the emotional imprisonment of the family. The color scheme bleeds into bone white. Even the portraits on the walls look starved. The Van Dort home, though richer in texture, carries the same anxiety, a nouveau riche attempt at elegance. There's something heartbreaking about the stillness of these rooms. They're filled with fine furniture, but nothing ever moves. It's as if life itself has been placed under glass. And then in one unholy twist the earth opens, and Victor is pulled into another world entirely. What's extraordinary is that Burton inverts everything we expect. The underworld is not dark, it's drenched in color. Here, the palette erupts in turquoise, fuchsia, orange, and teal, glowing as though the afterlife were lit by joy rather than sunlight. The shapes curve instead of point. The walls breathe instead of confine. Even the smoke seems to dance. Where the world above is ruled by verticals and repression, the world below is all circles and celebration. Burton once said he wanted the dead to look more alive than the living, and the contrast achieves exactly that. The transition between the two realms is one of the most beautiful in animation history. The camera dives through the soil, and suddenly the screen bursts into neon brass and laughter. The lighting shifts from candle flicker to nightclub glow. The silence above becomes a jazz rhythm below. It's not just a change of scenery. It's a resurrection through design. You feel liberated, as if someone has finally opened a window in a suffocating house. The underworld is grotesque, yes, but it's a grotesque that celebrates imperfection. Bones gleam like pearls, and decay turns into decoration. Burton cinematographer Pete Kozachik once described it as a musical instrument built from bones. Every object in both realms seems charged with meaning. The piano, central to Victor's character, is more than furniture. It's a confessional booth. Its ivory keys echo the film's color code, life's music hidden in death's palette. When Victor and Emily play together, the camera circles them like a ghost orbiting its memories, light bouncing between their faces, as though the piano itself were mediating their souls. The duet becomes architecture in motion, every note softening the straight lines of Victor's world, every harmony loosening the grip of gravity. Lighting functions like theology here. In the living world, illumination is external. Candles, chandeliers, oil lamps, always imposed from above, symbolizing order and control. In the underworld, light seems to emanate from within bodies and walls, an inner glow that suggests acceptance and warmth. Emily's luminescence is the bridge between the two. Her skin carries the light of the underworld into the land of oppression. You could switch off the score entirely and still feel the moral geography through brightness alone. Camera movement in Corpse Bride is equally expressive. Despite the miniature scale, the camera glides with dreamlike precision, swooping down corridors or circling characters as if moved by invisible wind. Burton avoids static composition. Instead, he creates the illusion of a restless soul wandering through claustrophobic rooms. In moments of emotional intensity, Victor practicing vows in the forest, Emily dissolving into butterflies, the lens behaves almost humanly, hesitant, trembling, then suddenly soaring. The technology was revolutionary, but the emotion remains old as cinema itself. Camera as conscience. Sound design deepens that spatial duality. In the world of the living, every sound feels distant, echoed through hallways, muffled by propriety. Footsteps click sharply, voices trail with reverb. The silence between words becomes louder than speech. In the world of the dead, everything is tactile. Laughter close to the ear, instruments jangling, bones rattling with warmth. Danny Elfman's score mirrors this divide. Harpsichord and muted strings above, swing band and brass below. The switch from minor to major keys literally accompanies each descent, as though morality itself had a soundtrack. The setting also carries historical weight, though fictional. The town echoes mid-Victorian England, an era when decorum was a religion and death an industry. Funeral culture, mourning etiquette, and class obsession all infuse the architecture. The Everglot's mansion resembles the social hierarchies of Dickens, while the underworld feels like a carnival resurrected from London's poorer districts, alive with the voices of those forgotten by history. This historical layer makes the film feel literary. It's as if Burton smuggled a moral essay about class beneath a ghost story. What's remarkable is how the environments reflect emotional truth rather than physical logic. The forest, for example, exists halfway between both worlds. Its twisted trees look dead yet pulse with quiet energy, their branches curling like fingers reaching toward release. It's where vows are spoken, mistakes are made, and redemption begins. The forest color temperature shifts constantly. Blue when Victor arrives, green when Emily emerges, golden when understanding dawns. It's the soul's landscape, mutable and uncertain. Even the smallest details obey symbolic grammar. Doors open inward in the living world, but outward in the underworld, signaling freedom versus confinement. In Victor's home, clocks dominate the decor. Time is tyrant. While in the realm of the dead, there are no clocks at all. The living chase schedule. The dead embrace eternity. Staircases above rise steep and narrow. Below, they spiral gracefully downward, inviting rather than commanding. The spatial language tells you everything you need to know about the character's psychological states. Color functions as moral commentary. Gray equals fear. Blue equals acceptance. Orange equals joy reborn from decay. Emily's blue, contrary to custom, isn't cold. It's compassionate. When she enters a gray church, the entire room momentarily softens. Her hue infects the space like forgiveness. By contrast, Lord Burkiss wears black tinged with green, a rot masquerading as nobility. His color never shifts, even under candlelight, which is Burton's visual way of saying corruption resists illumination. Depth of field plays a subtle role in emotional storytelling. Scenes in the living world often flatten perspective, compressing space until characters appear trapped between walls. In the underworld, the focus deepens. You can see far into glowing taverns and endless ballrooms. This expanding space mirrors liberation. When Emily finally releases Victor, the depth collapses again, closing into a soft blur of moonlight, as though reality were folding back into mercy. Then there are the skies. The living world heavens are perpetually clouded, a static gray wash, indifferent and inert. But in the underworld, the ceiling glows like an aurora. It's paradoxical. The dead live under a sky of movement. The living under one of stagnation. Burton once said he wanted the afterlife to feel like a bar that never closes and never judges. The setting accomplishes that. It's death as eternal cabaret. The cinematic rhythm of editing also ties setting to emotion. Cuts in the living world are deliberate and slow, almost staged like theater, emphasizing hesitation. In the underworld, cuts are musical, syncopated to the beat of Bone Jangles' jazz. The editing becomes choreography, teaching the audience to feel at ease amid bones and chaos. That contrast sustains the film's moral inversion. Death feels dynamic, life feels static. One of the most haunting visual motifs is mirrors, or, more precisely, their absence. In the living world, mirrors are everywhere, polished silver surfaces reflecting vanity and anxiety. In the underworld, there are none, because no one there needs to look at themselves. They already are what they are. The decision seems small, but it carries enormous thematic weight. The living are obsessed with reflection, the dead with connection. Cinematically, Burton and Kozaczek achieve this emotional geography through lighting tricks rather than digital filters. To desaturate the living world, they use gray gels on lights instead of altering color in post-production. For the underworld, they bounce colored light off metallic foils, creating organic hues that shifted naturally. The result is a film that feels tactile, colors that seem to breathe rather than scream. You can sense the warmth of the bulbs, the texture of the cloth backdrops, the dust motes caught in lens flare. It's analog sincerity in a digital decade. The forest set design, too, reveals Burton's obsession with liminality. Trees twist into cathedral arches, roots curl into benches, branches resemble skeletal fingers. It's simultaneously natural and architectural, life mimicking death, death mimicking life. The fog that swirls between trunks is real vapor, filmed under blue light, and reversed in playback to give it an unnatural rhythm. The sound team layered faint whispers into the wind, snippets of reverse dialogue from earlier scenes, so that the forest literally murmurs memory. Every cinematic choice feeds the film's central paradox. Death illuminates life. When Victor walks to the town early on, the camera barely moves. When he wanders the underworld, it floats. When he returns to the surface, the camera hesitates again, as though gravity itself were a social construct. Even framing reflects psychology. The living world favors symmetrical compositions, characters perfectly centered, suffocating in order. The underworld prefers diagonals and movement, a freedom that looks messy but feels honest. Music and setting intertwine until they become indistinguishable. Elfman's orchestration assigns instruments to spaces, strings to parlors, brass to taverns, woodwinds to the forest. The score doesn't just accompany scenery, it constructs it. When Emily appears, the orchestration switches from major to minor, but the melody continues seamlessly, suggesting that sorrow is simply joy seen from another world. The textures of the film, fabric, wood, stone, deserve their own paragraph. You can almost smell the dust in the church, feel the velvet decay of Emily's dress, hear the stiffness of Victor's collar. Every surface reflects its inhabitant. Polished mahogany for pretentious, cracked marble for the sincere. The tactile realism is so strong that you forget the scale. At one point, Emily's veil flutters across the screen, and it's easy to believe it weighs nothing. Yet each movement took hours to animate with wires thinner than hair. That patience infuses the environment with reverence. Burton's use of perspective blurs the line between stage and cinema. Scenes often open with a theatrical curtain effect, doors parting, light flooding in, then collapse into close-ups intimate enough to feel confessional. The world feels both grand and miniature, like a memory you can walk inside. This duality, epic yet intimate, gives the film its haunting timelessness. Symbolically, the entire setting operates as a metaphor for artistic creation. The living world is the blank page, sterile and anxious. The underworld is imagination, chaotic but alive. Victor's descent becomes an artist's journey into inspiration. His return the act of bringing something soulful back to a society that doesn't know it needs saving. The town's architecture, so proud, so pale, crumbles morally the moment color enters. It's as if art itself invades the mundane. Even the moon plays character here. It's enormous, omnipresent, watching over both life and death with equal indifference. Its light softens every tragedy, turning even Emily's dissolution into grace. The final image of butterflies ascending against that moon isn't simply pretty, it's cosmic symmetry. The world that began in shadow ends in illumination. What fascinates me most, though, is how silence functions as scenery. Between the music and dialogue lie stretches of stillness where you can hear dust settling. Those pauses are architectural. They build emotional rooms inside the film. When Victor and Emily share a look across the piano, or when Victoria listens through her barred window, the absence of sound becomes space, the interior landscape of longing. Few films understand that atmosphere isn't what you see or hear, but what you feel pressing between the two. And so, in its cinematic elements, Corpse Bride achieves something rare, a complete emotional ecology. Every light, shadow, sound, and angle contributes to one truth, that death isn't darkness, it's depth. The living world is flat because it's afraid. The underworld curves because it's free. Through setting alone, Burton tells us that to be alive is to suffocate beautifully, and to die is to dance without shame. When the credits finally roll, you remember not the plot, but the place. The gray streets, the blue taverns, the candlelit forest. They linger like rooms in a dream you once lived in. And maybe that's Burton's greatest accomplishment. He didn't just build a setting, he built a memory of one, a ghost town that continues to breathe every time we close our eyes. Behind every melancholy frame of Corpse Bride lies a small miracle of devotion. It's one of those films his making feels almost more poetic than its plot, a strange marriage between engineering and emotion, where hundreds of people gave years of their lives to coax ghosts into motion. Whenever I think about it, I picture the studio like a monastery, dark rooms glowing with tiny lamps, artisans bent over dolls, their fingers trembling with both caffeine and reverence. The quiet there must have been extraordinary, a silence filled not with emptiness but with concentration, the kind that hums when creation itself is happening. Tim Burton would walk the aisles between the miniature sets, like a priest among altars. The crew used to say they could tell his mood by the rhythm of his shoes on the concrete floor, slow and meditative when he was thinking, quick and restless when an idea struck. He was never loud. His authority came through stillness. Animators remember him crouching beside them, watching a puppet move 1 millimeter, then whispering, "That's beautiful. Let's keep it." That kind of approval, brief, quiet, but absolute, could carry them through another 16-hour day. The animators themselves were a peculiar breed of patient dreamers. They called each other frame keepers. Some of them spent entire months animating scenes that lasted less than 30 seconds. To keep morale alive, they wrote small notes to characters. You could open Emily's coffin on set and find folded papers reading, "Sleep well, darling," or "You'll glow again tomorrow." No one told them to do it. They just did. When you watch the film and feel its tenderness, you're feeling those invisible affections embedded inside the clay. Mike Johnson, Burton's co-director, ran the daily choreography. Every morning he'd conduct puppet roll call. He'd call out names, Victor A, Victor B, Emily 1, Emily 2, because there were duplicates of nearly every puppet, each designed for specific expressions or costumes. The duplicates had personalities of their own. Emily 2, for instance, had slightly looser joints, making her movement more fluid in dance scenes. Emily 3 was used for close-ups because her skin paint caught light more softly. Animators grew attached to these versions like actors to body doubles. Some even insisted that certain puppets were luckier than others. Superstition thrived in that studio. Small charms hanging from camera rigs, lucky coins on the stage lights, a shared belief that every ghost needed a guardian. Over time, Corpse Bride has aged into something gentler. It's no longer compared to The Nightmare Before Christmas. It's recognized as its own mood, softer, sadder, more forgiving. It's the difference between rebellion and reflection. Nightmare screams, Corpse Bride sighs. One wants to be seen, the other wants to be understood. And understanding always lasts longer. The film's box office numbers, its awards, even its place in Burton's filmography feel irrelevant now. What matters is how it lingers. People don't quote it to sound clever. They whisper it to remember someone. It's a film that doesn't end when it ends. It keeps unfolding quietly in the viewer, a piece of us dying and another piece waking up. Its genius lies in tone. Burton creates a world where death is not grotesque but tender, where decay glows softly, where darkness is just unrecognized color. Few directors have managed to turn morbidity into moral clarity. In that sense, Corpse Bride belongs to the same lineage as Cocteau's Orpheus or Miyazaki's Spirited Away. Films that treat death as continuation, love as metamorphosis, and art as a bridge between. Sometimes I wonder if Emily knew she was teaching us philosophy. Her gesture of release, that serene smile before she turns to light, feels like the film speaking directly to the audience. You can stop holding on now. Every viewer carries something different into that moment. Heartbreak, nostalgia, fear. But what returns is always gentler. The movie doesn't heal by erasing pain. It redeems pain by giving it purpose. Burton himself once said, "I've always believed ghosts aren't there to scare you. They're there to remind you that something mattered." That's what Corpse Bride does. It reminds us that love matters, that art matters, that kindness survived the grave. In a culture obsessed with beginnings, it gives endings a dignity of meaning. Even its flaws feel intentional. The slightly abrupt resolution, the brief runtime, the unspoken questions about what happens next. They echo the incompleteness of life itself. The story stops, but the emotion doesn't. The incomplete becomes perfect because it leaves space for memory. That's why people still return to it. They find themselves inside its unfinished sentences. And maybe that's the ultimate brilliance. It turns mortality into participation. We finish the story each time we remember it. Emily's butterflies live as long as we keep imagining them. Every rewatch is a resurrection. Every tear another heartbeat added to hers. The film's closing music encapsulates everything. Elfman's piano refrain, simple and circular, fading like a lullaby you can't unhear. It doesn't resolve in triumph. It drifts away, half resolved, echoing the heartbeat of someone who's accepted both joy and sorrow. That's the sound of peace, not absence, but acceptance. I think that's what Burton was reaching for all along. Not a gothic romance, but reconciliation between life and death, love and loss, art and imperfection. Corpse Bride isn't about dying. It's about remembering how to live with tenderness even after heartbreak. It tells us that to love someone, truly love them, is to release them, and to release someone is to love them again in a new form. Years later, when you stumble upon it again on a rainy evening, you'll notice something uncanny. It hasn't aged. Its clay hasn't cracked. Its sorrow hasn't dulled. It remains suspended in that timeless twilight between worlds, glowing faintly with everything we've forgotten how to say. That's the kind of immortality no sequel, no franchise, no algorithm can replicate. It's the immortality of sincerity. And so, the story that began with a trembling vow in the forest ends with light dissolving into sky. Not happily ever after, but truthfully ever after. Because truth, unlike happiness, doesn't fade. It just changes form like love, like butterflies, like art. So, my literature-loving friends, if this film has whispered to you, if it's reminded you that beauty can live inside sorrow, that endings can be beginnings, that even clay can feel like memory, then hold that whisper gently. That's all art ever asks, to be remembered softly. Thank you for sharing this journey through death, devotion, and resurrection with me. If it moved you even a little, let that feeling linger. And, of course, please subscribe, and ring the bell so that this little vault of cinema keeps breathing in the world of the living. Until next time, keep your hearts open, your promises true, and your ghosts kind.